Hello, I'm Roberta Levin, your professor for this course. This week, we will be covering cognitive development during the first 3 years. Before we get started, let's do a little review. 1 minute after birth, a neonate is tested for her reflex response to a catheter in her nostril. The test is repeated again 5 minutes after birth. The newborn responds by sneezing and given a score of 2. What is the name of this test? If you said Apgar score, you are correct. Congratulations. Let's try one more. Stillbirth refers to? What's your answer? It refers to the death of a fetus at or after 20 weeks gestation. If you got that correct, congratulations. If you missed one of these, it would be a good idea to go back and review the lesson from last week. Studying cognitive development, we will look at the 6 major approaches: behaviorist, psychometric, Piagetian, information processing, cognitive neuroscience, and social contextual. We will review each in detail, but let's begin with a brief description. The behaviorist approach is an approach to the study of cognitive development that is concerned with basic mechanics of learning. The psychometric approach is the approach to the study of cognitive development that seeks to measure intelligence quantitatively. The Piagetian approach is an approach to the study of cognitive development that describes qualitative stages in cognitive functioning. Information processing approach is an approach to the study of cognitive development that analyzes processes involved in perceiving and handling information. The cognitive neuroscience approach is an approach to the study of cognitive development that links brain processes with cognitive ones. And finally, the social contextual approach is an approach to the study of cognitive development that focuses on environmental influences, particularly parents and other caregivers. Did you know that when a baby is born, it can already see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and has some ability to remember what he or she learns? This is not fully unique to human beings, but any of you that has ever seen a new puppy or a new kitten knows that they are born with their eyes closed and do not have a way to see. This is important because it shows that even before birth, the baby is a complete human being. What we are going to talk a little more about is how babies learn. The behaviorist approach proposes 2 major mechanisms of learning. Classical conditioning is learning in which a person learns to respond, like a blink, to the stimulus of an object or a camera that originally did not elicit that response. It allows an infant to anticipate any event before it happens. It will become extinct if it is not reinforced. Operant conditioning focuses on how the consequences of behavior, for example, affection from a parent when a baby babbles, affect the likelihood that the behavior will occur again. Operant conditioning involves voluntary behavior. Behaviors that are rewarded become more likely. Behaviors that are punished become less likely. The textbook provided an example of a camera flash causing the baby to blink as an example of classical conditioning. It used a baby babbling and the parents responding with attention as an example of operant conditioning. Stop the video and see if you can write down one example of classical conditioning and one example of operant conditioning. Researchers can use operant conditioning to test the memory of babies. One researcher tied a string to a baby's ankle and to a mobile. Soon the baby learned that when it moved its ankle, the mobile moved. The result was the baby kicked more. Infant memory can be tested using operant conditioning. Researchers with everyday objects like mobiles show that infants do remember conditioned responses. At 2 months of age, the typical infant can remember a conditioned response for 2 days. 18 months old can remember it for 13 weeks. Brief nonverbal exposure to an original stimulus can sustain a memory from early infancy 1.5 to 2 years. This is Skinner's baby box. Here's another way to think about the concepts of operant conditioning. Skinner's famous baby box could provide the basis of an interesting discussion in which to clarify the principles of operant conditioning. The major focus of operant conditioning is the immediate environment. And for Skinner's second child, whose name was Deborah, he built this very controlled environment for the purposes of simplifying baby care. In other words, his wife wanted to get a little more sleep and get a few more things done. So the crib-sized living space was called the baby tender. And it had a large picture window and sound-absorbing walls. They had a mattress inside it and it had warmed and humidified air. And essentially, they could put the baby in there and the baby would be very comfortable. And they didn't have to have clothing on the baby because it was kept at this perfect temperature and humidity for the baby's comfort. It was possible to introduce sound systematically and to control exposures to pretty much everything, including light and temperature. And in essence, it made it easy to care for the baby. There was a lot of controversy about this at the time, and then there were later a lot of false reports about what was done. And part of it came out saying that, well, the result of this was that the infant ended up having significant problems. That turned out not to be true. Deborah actually grew up to be very successful. So it is interesting to think about these experiments that Skinner did with his own children at the time, which would not be considered appropriate now. I would suggest that you get together with either a person in your class or someone else and discuss this experiment, and there's a link to it that you can watch a little video about it. Do you see the baby tender as a safe and convenient parenting tool? If you said no, how do you feel about baby nannies, the little sound devices that basically let you keep at least audio track of what your baby's doing at any time, so you don't have to always be in the room with it. They are often called nanny cameras, and they allow continual monitoring. So this is a good discussion to continue your thinking about heredity versus the environment. nature versus nurture. And then also ask yourself, do you think this was an ethical thing to do? Do you think it would be approved of today? The psychometric approach is the next one that we will cover. Although there's no clear consensus on how to define intelligence, intelligent behavior is assumed to be goal-oriented and adaptive. IQ, or intelligence quotient, tests are psychometric tests that measure intelligence by comparing a test taker's performance with norms established by a large group of test takers. The goal is to quantitatively measure factors thought to make up intelligence and then predict future behavior. Intelligence testing with infants and toddlers can be challenging because they do not tell researchers what they know and how they think. Researchers test infant functioning and compare infants' performance to what an average baby can do at a certain age. If a baby cannot perform the task, he or she may be delayed. The Bailey scales of infants and toddlers' development assess children from 1 to 3.5 years in 5 areas: cognitive, language, motor, social, emotional, and adaptive behavior. An optional behavior rating scale can be used that depends on information that's provided only by the caregivers. Developmental quotients are calculated on each scale and are used for early detection of emotional disturbances and sensory, neurological, and environmental deficits, and can help parents prepare for their children's needs. Assessing the early home environment is important. The home observation for measurements of the environment, called home, measures the intellectual stimulation in a home. It assesses how the home influences children's cognitive growth. Home scores are correlated with measures of cognitive development. Socioeconomic status and home scores tend to be correlated across cultures. Home scores are correlated with cognitive function, language ability, and academic achievement. Research has identified a number of variables that are important. For example, the number of books in a home, the presence of educational playthings, parental involvement in children's play, and parental responses that show affection for the child, like hugging the child or kissing the child. Some early interventions include a systematic process of providing services to help families meet children's developmental needs. Generally, these would include a full day, year-round of early childhood education from infancy through preschool. Early educational interventions like Project CARE can offset environmental risk if they do the following. They need to start early and continue through preschool. They need to provide direct educational experiences, and they need to be holistic in terms of health, family counseling, and parental training. Early losses and gains after the program ends are expected, but they are less likely to require special education. In the Piagetian approach, the sensorimotor stage is from birth to about 2 years old. The sensorimotor stage is the first stage of cognitive development. Infants go from being responding based on reflex to being goal-oriented. Infants learn through senses and motor activity organized of cognitive schemes, which are patterns of thought and behavior used in particular situations. Cognitive growth comes through circular reactions, in which an infant learns to reproduce events originally discovered by chance. Piaget correctly described what children did under certain circumstances, even though he didn't get all of the stages fully correct. Let's take a quick look at the stages. There are substages of the sensorimotor stage. We know that reflexes, that where they gain control over their reflexes is up to about 1 month. The primary circular substage is 1 to 4 months, in which they repeat pleasurable chance behaviors, things like sucking their thumb. The secondary circular phase, substage, is 4 to 8 months. And in this substage, the infants repeat interesting actions. The coordinate secondary circular substage is 8 to 12 months. In this substage, there are purposeful, deliberate behaviors. The tertiary substage is 12 to 18 months, and it is a stage of curiosity and experimentation. And then the mental contribution substage is 18 to 24 months, and it is a period of symbolic thought and insight. The infant progresses to toddlerhood through the 6 sensorimotor stages, from birth to 24 months. If you take a look at Table 5.1 in your textbook, this shows you that much of the early development comes through circular reaction. Initially, it is all about reflexes and gathering control over those reflexes. If you touch the lips of a newborn, it will suck. Then the baby sucks its thumb so it gives it pleasure, so it repeats the behavior. In the primary circular reaction, the action and the responses involve the infant's own body. The perfect example then is thumb sucking. This is from 1 to 4 months. The secondary circular reaction is when the action gets a response from another person, leading to the baby's repeating the original action. One example is the baby coos and the mom reacts by giving the baby attention. This is about 4 to 8 months. The tertiary circular reaction is when actions get one pleasing result, leading the baby to perform similar actions to get those same results. This is usually 12 to 18 months. You see, the baby steps on the rubber ducky and it squeaks, so the baby squeezes the rubber ducky to get it to squeak. By the 6th substage, the child is in transition to the pre-operational stage of early childhood. The child has the ability to mentally represent objects and actions through symbols and words. They are beginning to think and develop knowledge about the world. Be sure to take a look at milestones 23 to 26 in your Connect site. It will be very helpful to understanding this content. There are 6 sensorimotor key developments: imitation, object permanence, symbolic development, categorization, causality, and number. Let's talk about each briefly. You will notice in Table 5.1 you have the concepts and skills, then the Piagetian view, and then more recent findings. Imitation is invisible imitation that develops from 9 months. Its deferred imitation begins with mental representation of about 18 to 24 months. There are controversial studies that have found invisible imitation of facial expressions in newborns and deferred imitation as early as 6 weeks. Deferred imitation of complex activities seem to exist as early as 6 months. Object permanence develops gradually between the 3rd and the 6th months. Infants as young as 3.5 months seem to show object knowledge through their looking behavior. We're going to discuss this a little bit more later. Symbolic development develops at 18 to 24 months with representational thinking. The understanding that pictures stand for something else occurs at about 19 months. Children under 3 have difficulty interpreting scale models. Categorization develops at 18 to 24 months with representational thinking. Infants as young as 3 months recognize perceptual categories. By the end of the first year, they categorize by function. Causality develops between 4 to 6 months and 1 year and is based on an infant's discovery, first of effects on its own actions and then of effects of outside forces. There is some evidence that early awareness of specific causal events in the physical world, but general understanding of causality may be slower to develop. And then finally, numbers. This develops between 18 and 24 months with the use of symbols. Infants as early as 5 months recognize and mentally manipulate small numbers, and interpretation of the findings of some of these studies is somewhat controversial, but let's talk about each of them a little bit more. Imitation becomes increasingly valuable in the first year of life as babies try on new skills. Visible imitation involves imitation with body parts that the babies can see. About 9 months old, babies engage in visible imitation of body parts the babies cannot see. Piaget believed children under 18 months could not engage in deferred imitation, that is, imitation after the passage of time. Research shows that this actually begins around 6 to 9 months. Deferred imitation is when a child can imitate a behavior after time has passed. This gets better with age as the child develops the ability to hold information for longer periods of time. Let's do a quick question. What might you expect in the second sensorimotor stage of Piagetian approach to cognitive development? If you don't know the answer, it's okay to go back and look it up. One answer would be that they learn to purposely repeat pleasant actions first achieved by chance. Object permanence is knowing that an object is there even if you can't see it. For example, if it is covered by a blanket. At first, the babies don't realize the object is still present, but by 18 to 24 months, they know it is there, even if they can't see it, and they will look for it. Object permanence is Piaget's term for the understanding that a person or object still exists when out of sight. Prior to 8 months, if the object is out of sight, it is forgotten. Between 8 and 12 months, infants will search in the last place an object was seen. At 18 to 24 months old, toddlers will look for an object, even if they do not see it hidden. This would be a good idea to stop the video and review milestone number 27 about object permanence. Symbolic development, pictorial competence, and understanding. Learning to interpret symbols, which are intentional representations of reality, is an essential task of childhood. For example, pictorial competence is the ability to understand the nature of pictures. Prior to 15 months old, infants use their hands to explore pictures as if they were objects, rubbing and patting. By age 2, children understand that a picture is both an object and a symbol. The child can look at a picture and name the object in it. You have probably seen toddlers do things that make us all laugh. They try to put on a hat that is too small or sit in a chair that is too small. Toddlers sometimes try to sit in a chair much too small for them. This is a scale error, momentary misperception of the relative size of objects. A toy chair is both an object as well as a symbol for a class of things, all chairs. The dual representation hypothesis proposes that children under age 3 have difficulty grasping spatial relationships because of the need to keep more than one mental representation in mind at the same time. The toddler can't distinguish between the reality that the chair is an object, but it is also a symbol of similar objects. It is one of the reasons some recommend against baby media that implies to the parents it provides educational benefits. The learning primarily occurs when the parents review the content with the toddler, not the toddler just watching content on a video. Let's talk about visual preference. Infants spend more time looking at some objects than others, indicating their visual preference. Babies less than 2 days old prefer new sights to familiar sights, which is a novelty preference. Newborns distinguish between familiar stimulus and unfamiliar stimulus when shown both at the same time. The visual recognition memory implies a rudimentary representational ability that exists at birth or very soon after and quickly becomes more efficient. Let's talk a little bit about evaluating Piaget's sensorimotor stages. Was Piaget correct? Did he get it all right? Let's think about it. It could be that Piaget, part of what Piaget was seeing was an immature ability to express themselves in words. So maybe part of what he was responding to was that infants don't express themselves in words, and it may not have been a lack of cognitive ability. Modern tools available to researchers have made this more obvious. However, Piaget was basically correct about the progression of skills from an infant to toddler. In short, the more we learn, the more we are able to learn. Recent research suggests that about 90% of parents report that their children under 2 years of age use electronic media technology that is geared toward early learning. Researchers believe that infants and toddlers are unable to comprehend the meaning of what they are viewing until about 24 months of age. So, how do infants learn? Piaget believed that our senses are not connected when we are born and that they gradually integrate through our experiences. That integration begins almost immediately after birth. Neonates will look at a source of a sound, indicating that they associate hearing and sight. A more sophisticated ability is cross-modal transfer. the ability to use information gained by one sense to guide another, sight and sound, such as negotiating a dark room by feel versus sight, cross-modal transfer of some but not all senses is available at birth. The capacity for joint attention, as when babies follow the gaze of an adult's gaze by looking or pointing in the same direction, develops about 10 to 14 months. Habituation. Let me give you an example. Your baby is lying in the crib sucking its thumb and sees something interesting. Maybe it's a light reflecting on the wall. The baby will slow the sucking of the thumb when it is interested in the light. But when it gets bored with the light, it will go back to sucking the thumb faster. This is habituation. Now, if you give the baby something new and interesting to focus on, the baby will again slow the sucking of the thumb and pay attention and slow the thumb sucking. This is dishabituation. The researcher measures the time it takes for the baby to first focus on the stimulus and then lose interest in it. The quicker the baby habituates, the more it is associated with cognitive development. It may be a predictor of intelligence. Habituation is learning that results from repeated or continuous exposure to a stimulus. It tells us how interested an infant is in what's happening. If it looks away, it is most likely bored. Dishabituation is an increase in responsiveness after the presentation of a new stimulus. Research with infants isn't as easy as asking them what they prefer. One tool that can be used is visual preference, which is the tendency to spend more time looking at one thing than another. A baby will look at a curved line longer than a straight line, implying that it's more interesting and they prefer it. The same is true with pictures of faces versus random objects or two-dimensional objects versus three-dimensional objects. The same is true with new things they haven't seen over the ones they see all the time. They prefer the new, which is referred to as novelty preference. So the tools used in infant research include visual preference, which is the tendency to spend more time looking at one thing than another. Novelty preference is the tendency to prefer new sights over familiar sights. Information processing can be a predictor of intelligence. A complex task can be analyzed to figure out what abilities are necessary for each part of the task. 4 core cognitive domains are associated with IQ, including attention, processing speed, memory, and representation competence, as indexed by cross-modal transfer and the ability to anticipate future performance. Research shows that performance on these tasks in infancy is related to performance on these tasks in toddlerhood, as well as performance on IQ tests at 11 years of age. Dividing the world into meaning categories really is vital to thinking about objects or concepts and their relationships, forming the foundation of language, reasoning, and problem solving. Infants first categorize on the basis of perceptual features, such as shape and color. Piaget believed that the ability to categorize didn't appear until 18 months. It turns out they do this much earlier. For example, by 3 to 4 months, they can distinguish between a dog and a cat. Of course, My cats wonder how anyone couldn't immediately recognize the difference. After all, cats are superior beings. By 12 to 14 months, their categories become conceptually based on real-world knowledge of functioning. So they know that a zebra-striped chair is furniture, and not actually the animal, a zebra. Now let's talk about causality. Infants as young as 4.5 months can understand simple causality, so a ball knocking another ball out of position. However, only infants who have practiced playing with a Velcro-covered ball and Velcroed mittens were able to do this. By 6 months, the ability is more robust and does not require training. At the 7-month-old, babies appear to understand that an object is not able to move by itself. You actually do have to throw the tennis ball. By 8 months, infants make causal attributions to simple events, and by 10 to 12 months, the inferences are even more sophisticated. Let's look at an example. Piaget thought that babies didn't have object permanence, which is to say that if an object was hidden, they didn't realize it was still there. He thought this because they didn't reach for hidden objects. Other researchers thought it may be because the babies didn't yet have the motor skills to reach for the objects, so they designed studies to test violations of expectations. This works by making sure the infant is familiar with an expectation. You do this through habituation. Do you remember what habituation is? If not, it's a good time to stop the presentation and go back and review your notes. If the infant looks longer at what violates its expectations, that indicates it is surprised. Now, if you look at slides, what they did was they showed a small carrot and it being blocked, and then obviously you can't see the carrot. A large carrot and it being blocked and you can't see it. Those are possible events. Now, if you look then in this slide, and you look right here, this small carrot, you see this notch, right? Perfect sense. You would not expect to see the small carrot here, even though there's a notch, because the carrot is smaller than the line. The babies see that, no big deal, right? But if you put this large carrot with a notch, and the carrot's clearly, when it goes behind here, should be visible here, the babies will look at this with surprise. They will look at this longer than they look at this. And that is because they expect to be able to see the carrot here. For babies to be more interested in the possible event, it shows that they know the object should be there. Because they look longer at the impossible event, it indicates surprise or that they had object permanence. And finally, numbers. The violation of expectations paradigm was also used to test babies' understanding of numbers. 5-month-old babies watched Mickey Mouse dolls added or subtracted behind a screen. When the screen was lifted, babies looked longer at wrong answers. Other experiments were done to confirm that they understood numbers rather than just the shapes being wrong. Let's move on to cognitive neuroscience approach. Brain growth spurts, which are periods of rapid growth and development, coincide with changes in cognitive behavior. Cognitive neuroscience scientists use brain scans to provide physical evidence of two separate long-term memory systems, implicit and explicit. Implicit memory refers to unconscious recall, generally of habits and skills. It is also referred to as procedural memory. Explicit memory, or declarative memory, is conscious or intentional recollection of facts, names, and events. Delayed imitation of complex behavior is evidence of declarative memory. This is present by 6 months. Working memory. In early infancy, memories are fleeting. As the hippocampus matures deep in the temporal lobes, along with development of the cortical structures coordinated by the hippocampal formation, longer-lasting memories are possible. The prefrontal cortex, the large portion in the frontal lobe directly behind the forehead, develops the capacity for working memory at about 6 to 12 months, which is short-term storage of information that the brain is actively processing. This portion develops more slowly and is more sensitive to the environment. Because working memory develops late, it may be the reason for the slow development of object permanence. How children learn about the world they were born into is impacted by their culture. Whether a child learns in very rigid ways or through guided participation with an adult depends on where you live and the culture of the parents. Think back. Did your parents teach you to tie your shoes by showing you? Or did they use words that you may still remember today? Vygotsky's social-cultural theory has influenced the study of how cultural context affects early social interactions. Social interactions promote cognitive competence. Guided participation refers to a mutual interaction with adults that help structure children's activities, bridging the gap between a child's understanding and adults. There are cultural differences. For example, in the United States, children and parents engage in more play activities, and Guatemalan children and parents engage in more work activities. Language is a communication system based on words and grammars. Once children know words, they can use them to represent objects and actions. Children display a typical sequence of linguistic milestones. The forerunner to linguistic speech is pre-linguistic speech, which consists of cooing and babbling, then accidental imitation and deliberate imitation of sounds without understanding their meaning. The theories of language acquisition. In the 1950s, there was a debate of whether linguistic ability was learned or inborn. Behaviorists like B.F. Skinner believe language is learned through reinforcement and imitation. Noam Chomsky argued for nativism, specifically that people have an inborn capacity for language acquisition. He referred to as language acquisition device. Most developmental scientists maintain that language acquisition is a combination of both nature and nurture. Let's take a look at some of the milestones. Language is so important. We should spend a little bit of time reviewing the language milestones from Table 5.2 in your textbook. We don't pop out of the womb using words, but we first have pre-linguistic speech, which is the sound that babies make. At birth, they can perceive speech, cry, and make some response to sound. 1.5 to 3 months, they coo and they laugh. 5 to 7 months, they recognize frequently heard sound patterns and phonemes of native language. At 6 to 10 months, babies, they babble in strings of consonants and vowels. 9 to 10 months, they intentionally imitate sounds. 9 months to 12 months, they use social gestures. 10 to 12 months, they no longer can discriminate sounds not in their own native language. 10 to 14 months, it says the first word, usually labeling of something. 12 to 13 months, they understand the symbolic function of naming. Passive vocabulary starts to grow. 13 to 14 months, they use more elaborate and symbolic gestures. 16 to 24 months, they learn many new words, expanding expressive vocabulary rapidly from about 50 words to about 400. And they use verbs and adjectives. 18 to 24 months, they say their first sentence, which is really only a 2-word sentence, but still, it's their first sentence. 20 months, they use fewer gestures and name more things. 20 to 22 months, they have comprehension spurts. At 24 months, they use many 2-word phrases. It's no longer babbles. What they do is they want to talk. And at 30 months, they learn new words almost every day. They speak in combinations of 3 or more words, and they make a lot of grammatical mistakes. And at 36 months, they say up to 1,000 words. 80% are intelligible, and they make some mistakes in syntax. Now that we went through the language milestones, let's discuss early vocalization. Crying is a newborn's first means of communication. Between 6 weeks and 3 months, babies start cooing when they are happy, such as squealing and gurgling. Babbling is repeating consonant vowel strings like da 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 that appears between 6 and 10 months and is often mistaken for a baby's first word. Of course, this makes new dads very happy. As we respond to their sounds, they repeat those sounds. What is first accidental imitation becomes intentional as they learn. We know that babies imitate the sounds we make, and for them to be able to do that, they have to be able to distinguish subtle differences in sounds. Language is made of small units of sound called phonemes. In English, dog has 3 females, D, O, and G. Every language has their own. My guess is there are many people in this class that English is not their first language. When we are babies, we have the natural ability to discriminate the sounds of any language, but over time, we narrow down to the patterns which are native to our language. It is one of the reasons it is hard for us to learn proper pronunciation of foreign languages as adults. Infants' brains seem to be preset to perceive linguistic patterns and categorize them as similar or different. The process of sound discrimination begins in the womb. Fetuses' heart rate slow when they hear familiar nursery rhymes. By 6 months, babies learn to recognize basic sounds of their native language, referred to as phonemes. By 8 months, they begin to lose sensitivity to the phonemes that are not used in their native language. Most of the world speaks tonal languages. In Thai, there are 5 tones: low, mid, high, rising, and falling. The tone changes the meaning of the word. The perception of the phonemes in a native language emerges around 6 to 12 months, but the tone seems to emerge much earlier. Pay attention to your own language. It has more meaning than what is said in words. If you speak 2 or more languages, consider when you learned them and which one you consider dominant. What are you feeling when you speak in a louder voice? Does the pitch ever change? Do you know why? And then there are gestures. Before babies can speak, they can point. Gestures show that symbols refer to specific objects and wants. Most babies learn conventional social gestures by 12 months. They can wave bye-bye. They can nod their head yes or no. Representational gestures such as holding an empty cup to the mouth to indicate thirst. Symbolic gestures like blowing to mean hot or sniffing to mean flower. The first words usually come between 10 and 14 months, initiating linguistic speech, the verbal expression that conveys meaning. A single word used to convey a complete thought is called hollow phrase. By 18 to 24 months, children follow social cues to learn new words, and by 24 months, they recognize names of familiar objects, even in the absence of visual cues. Receptive vocabulary refers to words an infant understands and gradually becomes faster and more accurate. Expressive vocabulary is an infant's repertoire of spoken words. By 18 months, children know about 150 words and can say about 50 of them, meaning they understand more than they can repeat. The next important linguistic breakthrough comes when a toddler puts two words together to express an idea. Want juice? Which occurs around 18 to 24 months. The telegraphic speech consists of only a few essential words and is directed at what they want. For example, want juice, go outside. Around 20 to 30 months, they get comfortable using articles, prepositions, nouns, verbs, and plurals. Understanding grammar precedes the use of it. An extension of word meaning is using words in too narrow of a category, such as doggy, only referring to the family pet and not all dogs. An overextension is using words too broadly, such as referring to all men as grandpa. Young children also overregularize rules, such as saying, I drawed that, instead of I drew that. Language also develops in deaf children in many of the same ways it develops in hearing children. Babies that are deaf learn sign language in the same fashion as hearing infants learn speech. Babies that are deaf imitate sign language they see their parents using. As parents reinforce these gestures, the babies attach meaning to them. Babies that are deaf hand babble and use sentences in sign language at about the same ages as hearing infants voice babble and speak in sentences, suggesting an inborn language capacity that is tied to brain maturation. Of course, much of language is dependent on brain development. Tremendous brain growth during the early months is linked with language development. A newborn cries are controlled by the brainstem and the pons, the primitive parts of the brains. Repetitive babbling emerge from maturation of parts of the motor cortex. In toddlers with large vocabularies, brain activation focuses on the left temporal and parietal lobes. In about 98% of people, the left hemisphere is dominant for language. Language is a social act that necessarily involves interaction with other people. It does not develop the same when children are only exposed to TV or are deprived of social interaction. It isn't just parents, but siblings, caregivers, and friends that impact language development. If the mom has a higher socioeconomic status and talks more to the infant, it is going to have a larger vocabulary. By 3 years old, the vocabularies of children from low-income households vary greatly, depending on the word types they have heard from their moms or their caregivers. We know that babies respond well to high-pitched sing-song voices, which is called child-directed speech. It is also referred to as motherese or parentese or baby talk. It is something that we all do naturally with children, and we even do it with our pets. Language is a social act. In households where more than one language is spoken, bilingual children use elements of both language in code mixing. The ability to shift from one language to another is code switching. Child-directed speech, or motherese, or parentese, or baby talk, is a form of speech used in talking to babies and toddlers. It includes so simplified speech, a high-pitched tone, exaggerated vowel sounds, short words and sentences, and much repetition. There are cultural differences in the books people read to their children, but what is important is to read to them. Children love it when you read to them. They love to be read to. Reading to children improves their language skills and cognitive ability. It encourages creativity, and it promotes social and moral development. The same could be true about reading in early adulthood or at any point in your life. Do you have any questions? If you do, I encourage my students to join me for office hours that are listed on the syllabus or contact me via email. Thank you.